the American interest was limited, really, other than the missionaries, right? The British and French interest was not significant. But there were three countries that were very interested in Korea. And in the late 19th century, each of those countries fought to be the dominant influence in Korea. One was China, because China was trying to survive. It was being threatened. It had suffered several invasions by Russians, British, and French, and it was trying to survive as an empire. And what one of the strategies was, and by the way, they did succeed because China's still there, and the Chinese Empire survived. Now it's called the People's Republic of China, but it's the same empire. And but one of their strategies was to protect their periphery. And in the late 19th century, they were very involved in western part of China, in the Uyghur region. They were involved in Mongolia. They were involved in the southern borders. And they got involved in Korea because Korea is on the periphery, and it's a good staging board for further penetration in the country. So they wanted to control the periphery. So the Chinese became very deeply involved in Korea and sought to basically bring Korea, not to conquer Korea, but to bring it under their control. Right. The third power, so you have a declining China trying to survive by strengthening its control over Korea. You have an expanding Russia. Now, Russia was becoming an Asian power. The Russians were expanding in Asia. They had, in 1860s, 70s, 80s, they conquered Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and all the Central Asian countries. They were moving into Mongolia. In 1860, they acquired a section of Siberia that had previously been ruled by China. That's how they established a border with Korea. And after 1860, they established this new Pacific port, Vladivostok, and they wanted to become a Pacific power, but they needed warm water ports, right, where their ships could use. And on their new southern border was Korea. So the Russians became very interested after 1860 in acquiring control over Korea. The third imperialist power was Japan, because Japan was modernizing, but it was also aping the West, not just in the form of governments and science and technology and industry, but also, like all good Western powers, it was becoming an imperialist, and it was acquiring. It annexed Okinawa. It conquered Sakhalin, these islands in the north, and it was and high on its priority was control of Korea. As the Japanese described it, a dagger pointing at the heart of Japan, and also a staging board for further entry into the continent of Asia. So those three countries contested control over Korea, which is very bad for the Koreans, because the Koreans were desperately trying to modernize their country. They had 2 or 3 centuries of evolution and science and ideas about science and technology and government and society that they were all learning all at once, having been previously pretty isolated. And they were busy trying to figure out what they had to do to survive. In the meanwhile, China and Russia and Japan were all backing different factions and attempting to control the country. And they clashed. China and Japan went to war over Korea, 1894 to 1895. Japan won, and China was out after 1895. Now it was just between Russia and Japan, and the two countries had tried to manipulate government in Korea, different factions. There were pro-Russian factions, pro-Japanese factions. And eventually this led to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. And after a year of fighting, the Japanese surprised the world, actually, by defeating Russia. And in 1905, Russia was forced to recognize Japanese control of Korea. and now there was nobody left, and the only two powers there were Britain and the United States, and both of them signed secret agreements, basically saying, "Yeah, you can take over Korea if you want to." There was a secret. There was a secret agreement signed in 1905 with the United States, and it says Japan can do whatever it wants to in Korea as long as the Japanese recognize American authority in the Philippines. It's called
Ah,
the
okay.
Katsura Agreement. And it wasn't a formal treaty, it was an agreement. So there was nothing actually technically, and not widely publicized. But in 1905, the Americans simply closed their embassy and left. So, so the only power that could have stood in the way of taking over Korea was gone. And so now, with the blessings of Britain and the United States, Japan took over Korea.
So
And you
before that,
might say, why did the Britain
yeah.
interested? And that was because the British were had signed in 1902 an alliance with Japan to counter Russia. So the British decided they would back better Japan than Russia.
And before that, what were the what was the British Empire and the US interested in Korea? What resources? Or I understand Chinese ambitions for trying to conquer their peripheral, and Russia's and Japanese intentions, but Europeans and US intentions, what resources were they trying to gather?
The Russians, by the way, the Chinese interests were purely strategic. Russian interests were both strategic and economic, and the Russians were involved economically in Korea, for instance, in the timber industry. A little interesting aside, a Russian family who got very rich in Korea, its name was the Brenner family, and the Brenner mansion in Siberia is a tourist attraction today. They had this extravagant mansion, and some older people would know that the grandson of this big Korean timber baron that got rich in Korea became a famous actor named Yul Brynner. And some people who know movies will know who he was. But so the Russians had an economic stake, but I think they were just as much a strategic stake. And the Japanese was strategic and economic as well. They were interested. One thing the Japanese were very interested in Korea was rice. Japanese were having rice is the mainstay, and the Japanese were having trouble feeding their rapidly growing population and industrializing population, urbanizing, industrializing. And they saw Korea as a source of rice to feed the population.
So now Japan has annexed Korea, and what happened after that?
Well, the Japanese, here's where the situation comes a little strange. When the Japanese occupy Korea, the Japanese had no clear policy among themselves.